Sit down and shut up, lady. You either move back where you belong, or I'll have security drag you off this damn plane.
A black woman in her late 50s, dressed in a simple dark sweater and comfortable slacks, rolled a small suitcase through the sliding doors of George Bush Intercontinental Airport in Houston. No one around her knew that she was the person who had built the very airline they were about to fly with. Morning light spilled across the polished floor as automatic doors sighed open and shut, letting in gusts of warm Texas air. Evelyn Carter paused for a heartbeat near the entrance, letting the familiar sounds wash over her. The low rumble of rolling luggage, the distant murmur of boarding calls, a child laughing somewhere near the check-in counters. Airports had marked so many chapters of her life. Some of those chapters were painful, some were triumphant. Today, she hoped, would be quiet. She checked the time on her phone, even though she knew she was early. Her daughter had insisted. "You are not missing this trip, Mom," the last message had said, followed by a photo of a little girl missing her front teeth and holding up a handmade sign that read, in crooked crayon, "Welcome, Grandma." Evelyn had smiled at that on the ride over, sitting in the back of the rideshare as it slipped onto the freeway, past billboards and overpasses and endless lines of cars all hurrying somewhere. Now, inside the terminal, she moved with unhurried steps toward the Blue Sky Airways check-in area. The logo she had chosen years ago glowed above the counters, that curved line of blue that was meant to suggest both a wing and a bridge. People stood beneath it without a second thought, handing over passports, asking about seats and bags. To them, it was just another airline. To her, it was a long, hard-fought promise that people like her deserved to feel safe between earth and sky. At the self-service kiosk, she printed her boarding pass, even though she could have used her phone. The paper in her hand felt solid, incontrovertible. Her name, her route from Houston to New York, her seat in the first rows of the cabin. She stared for a moment at the row and seat numbers, remembering another boarding pass a lifetime ago that had not been enough to protect her from a sneer and a demand to move. She folded the memory away with the ticket, sliding it into her bag. The smell of fresh coffee drifted from a familiar chain cafe nearby. Evelyn joined the end of the line, hands resting lightly on her suitcase handle. In front of her, a young couple talked excitedly about visiting Times Square for the first time. Behind her, someone argued quietly on the phone about a missed connection. The barista moved quickly, calling out names, sliding cups down the counter. When it was her turn, Evelyn ordered a simple black coffee and a small muffin. The total came up on the screen, and she tapped her card, then dropped a few folded bills into the tip jar without much ceremony. The barista glanced up, surprised by the extra generosity for such a modest order, and gave her a warm smile. "Thank you, ma'am. Have a great flight," he said. "You too," she answered with a small laugh, then corrected herself. "I mean, have a good day." Cup balanced in one hand, she found a table near a window where she could watch aircraft trundle between gates. A Blue Sky jet slowly backed away from its bridge, tug vehicle lumbering along in front like a stubborn ox. She had sat in countless meetings about fuel efficiency, cabin layouts, new routes, the color of the seat fabric. She had worked through nights to convince cautious investors that a black woman from the South could understand aviation and balance sheets as well as anyone. Looking at the plane outside, she felt both pride and a quiet, wary curiosity. How do they treat people when they think no one important is watching, she wondered. That question had followed her for years, from small regional flights where she had seen elders spoken to like children, to big city routes where tired workers were treated as if they were invisible. It was the reason she sometimes traveled just like this. No assistance, no escort, no one to announce her arrival. Just another passenger with a carry-on bag and a boarding pass. Her phone buzzed on the table. The name on the screen made her smile. "Good morning, Robert," she said when she answered. On the other end, Robert Mitchell's voice came through, warm and a little gravelly with age. He had been with Blue Sky from the early days, through rough quarters and skeptical headlines. "Morning, Evelyn. Just calling to be sure you are actually going," he teased. You have a habit of canceling trips to stay and put out fires." "I am at the airport already," she replied. "You would be proud. I even got here early." He chuckled. "That committee in Harlem is not going to let you off the hook if you miss this. They have your photo on the program and everything. And your granddaughter won't forgive you if you don't show up for dinner." "I know," she said softly, feeling a familiar tug in her chest. "This one I can't miss." They spoke for a few minutes more about the upcoming board agenda, a regulatory report that needed her signature, and then Robert shifted his tone. "Evelyn," he said, "I heard you booked yourself on a regular ticket again. No one meeting you at the gate, no little sign with your name on it. You do realize you could make life easier for yourself?" She looked out at the busy concourse. No one gave her a second glance. A family hurried past with matching backpacks. A man in a suit argued about a delayed flight at a nearby counter. "I like to see things the way they really are," she replied, "not the way people act when they know the boss is watching." There was a pause, then a low sound of understanding from his end. "Just take care of yourself," he said. "Some of those real moments can hurt." "They always have," she answered, "but they also tell us where we still need to work." After they said goodbye, she finished her coffee and rose, tossing the empty cup into the bin. The boarding pass crackled faintly in her hand as she walked toward the security checkpoint, joining the line with everyone else. The ritual felt familiar. Shoes off, laptop out, belt in the tray. A transportation security officer checked her identification with a neutral expression, handed it back, and directed her through. Past security, the terminal opened up again into a wide, bright hallway lined with shops and restaurants. Signs overhead pointed toward different concourses. Her flight information on the screen sent her toward one of the long arms of the airport where the blue sky gates clustered together. The path took her past a newsstand where newspapers still sat in racks for those who preferred ink on their fingers to glowing screens. One of the front pages carried a small story about the upcoming event in Harlem, mentioning her name in a short paragraph. It was strange, seeing herself described in third person like that. "Evelyn Carter, founder and chairwoman of Blue Sky Airways, will be honored." A girl buying gum glanced at the paper and then at Evelyn, but did not make the connection. The older woman kept walking. Near the gate area, a sign for the Blue Sky Lounge came into view. Her ticket, of course, allowed her entry. She debated skipping it, then decided there was no harm in sitting for a while away from the noise. Inside, the air was cooler and quieter, the light softened. Soft chairs faced large windows, and a long counter held trays of fruit, pastries, and small sandwiches. A bartender wiped down the polished surface of a small bar, ready to pour a glass of wine for anyone who asked. A television on the wall showed a news channel with the sound turned down. Evelyn chose a seat in a corner near the glass where she could see the runway. She set her suitcase beside her and pulled a folder out of her bag, the notes for her speech in Harlem. The words on the pages spoke of opportunity, of the long road from segregated waiting rooms to executive suites, of the responsibility that came with success. As she read, she could hear in her mind the voices of elders who had marched before she was born, who had been pushed to the back of buses and told to use different doors. Behind her, the door to the lounge opened with a soft hiss. A burst of bright perfume drifted in. A woman's confident laugh followed, light and practiced. Evelyn did not turn immediately, but the sound of the staff greeting the newcomer was impossible to miss. "Good morning, Ms. Reynolds," the attendant at the desk said warmly. "So good to see you again." "How are you all doing?" the woman replied. "I feel like I live in this place." There was a hint of amusement in her voice, the tone of someone used to being recognized and remembered. Footsteps clicked across the floor, and in the reflection of the window, Evelyn caught a glimpse of a tall, fair-skinned woman in an elegant coat, designer bag draped over her arm. The bartender was already preparing a glass of white wine without being asked. Evelyn lowered her eyes back to her notes, not wanting to eavesdrop, but the rhythm of the exchange was familiar.
For years, she had watched how the world bent just a little towards certain people and away from others, often without anyone realizing they were doing it. She made a few edits to her speech with a pen, crossing out a sentence, rewriting another. She did not want to sound bitter. She wanted to sound clear, honest, hopeful if she could manage it. After a while, the lounge announcement system chimed softly. A calm voice informed passengers that boarding for her Blue Sky flight would begin at the gate in a short time. People began to gather their things, brushing crumbs from their trousers, closing laptops, slipping phones into pockets. Evelyn slid her papers back into the folder and tucked it safely into her bag. She checked that her boarding pass was still where she had put it, then rose, smoothing the front of her sweater with an old habit she had never quite lost. The woman called Ms. Reynolds.
Reynolds laughed at something the bartender said, then emptied the last of her wine in one practiced tilt of the glass. Outside the lounge, the terminal was a little more crowded now, voices overlapping under the constant hum of the building. The large windows near her departure gate showed a Blue Sky plane resting at the end of its bridge, nose pointed patiently toward the horizon. Ground crew in bright vests moved around it like small, busy insects. Her phone buzzed one more time as she approached the seating area. A photo came through from her daughter, the granddaughter again, this time in the kitchen, flour on her nose, holding a pie with both hands. The caption read, "We will wait for you, do not make us eat this without you." Evelyn smiled, the lines at the corners of her eyes deepening. She slipped the phone away, feeling the weight of all the years between the life she had started in a small southern town and this one, in an airport where her name was printed on metal and glass but unknown to most of the people rushing past. When the loudspeaker finally pinged, the boarding call cut through the noise of the gate area. The agent's voice invited passengers on Blue Sky Flight 417 to New York to prepare. First came the pre-boarding groups, then the priority lanes. When the boarding call for Blue Sky Flight 417 to New York sounded, Evelyn rose, picked up her suitcase, and made her way toward the gate. In her mind, an unseen camera followed her, then slid past her shoulder to linger for a moment on the self-satisfied face of the woman from the lounge as she stepped into the priority line, leaving anyone watching to wonder how these two travelers would collide once they were both in the same sky. The line at the gate inched forward, a slow, familiar shuffle toward the open door of the waiting Blue Sky jet. Evelyn handed her boarding pass to the agent, who scanned it with a soft beep and nodded her through with a practiced smile. The narrow jet bridge smelled faintly of metal and the sharp, recycled coolness of conditioned air. Ahead, the doorway of the aircraft framed a slice of bright cabin light and the hint of navy blue uniforms moving inside. A young flight attendant at the door greeted each passenger with the same phrase, repeated like a gentle drumbeat, "Welcome aboard." When Evelyn stepped through, the attendant's eyes flicked briefly to the print on the boarding pass, then back up to her face. "Good morning, ma'am. You are in first class, seat 2A, just to your left," she said, gesturing down the aisle. Evelyn thanked her and turned into the small, self-contained world of the first-class cabin. It was a compact space, no more than a few rows, separated from the rest of the plane by a low divider and a curtain currently tied back. Wide seats waited on either side of a central aisle, each with a folded blanket and a small bottle of water ready on the armrest. Overhead bins stood open, like empty shelves, inviting luggage to be tucked away. She found row 2 and paused, taking in the window seat on the left. Seat 2A. The small metal plaque by the headrest seemed to echo the words printed on her boarding pass. She lifted her suitcase into the bin, feeling the easy strength still in her shoulders despite the years. A younger man across the aisle glanced up, then quickly looked back at his phone. Evelyn sat down and felt the cushion give beneath her, the smooth fabric cool against her palms. The view out the oval window showed only the side of the jet bridge and a sliver of cloudy sky, but even that small slice of light anchored her. She placed her smaller bag under the seat in front, slid the folder with her speech into the seat pocket, and let herself breathe for a moment. This, she thought, is what all those long nights were for.
Not just her own comfort, but the idea that anyone with a ticket and a name on a list should be able to sit where they are supposed to sit and not be made to feel they were borrowing space they did not deserve. Her fingers traced the edge of the boarding pass once more, feeling the slight indent where her name had been pressed into the paper. Somewhere behind her, in the main cabin, passengers were still arranging their bags, coaxing children into seats, negotiating overhead bin space. A soft murmur rose and fell, punctuated by the thump of closing compartments and the occasional short laugh. A few rows back, in the first row of the main cabin, Tyler Nguyen buckled his own seatbelt and slipped his phone into the pocket of his hoodie. He had claimed a window seat and now watched through his little oval at the distant movement of other aircraft. He had not thought much about first class when he boarded, except for a quick glance at the wider seats as he passed them. That world felt far away from his habit of budget flights and student discounts.
Yet his ears, like everyone else's, registered the hum of the cabin, the rhythm of voices, the way quiet could shift without anyone quite knowing why. Up front, a man in a slightly different cut of Navy uniform moved with the air of someone in charge. Mark Phillips checked the overhead bins, adjusted a slightly crooked pillow, and gave a few last-minute instructions to the attendants in a low voice. He liked the first-class cabin. It felt more manageable, more controlled, and the passengers there often knew the rules without being told, or, at least, that was how he liked to think of it. From her seat, Evelyn saw him only as another uniformed presence, an outline passing the row, making mental notes. He glanced down at her once, his eyes moving over the simple dark sweater, the plain slacks, the sensible shoes. He offered a professional smile and moved on. If he wondered whether she belonged there, he did not say so. Not yet. More passengers trickled in. A man with silver hair stored a garment bag overhead. A woman in a business suit clicked away at a laptop, fingers flying. The air filled gradually with the faint scent of cologne, coffee carried on board in cardboard cups, the sharp tang of disinfectant that lingered in every airplane. Then a new sound cut through the murmur, a light, confident laugh that Evelyn recognized from the lounge, even before she saw the woman attached to it. Catherine Reynolds stepped through the curtain into first class as if entering a familiar living room. Her coat fell open to reveal a pale blouse and a tailored skirt, her heels clicking against the aisle floor in a steady rhythm. Her carry-on bag was compact but unmistakably expensive, the leather soft and well-worn. She glanced up at the row numbers out of habit more than necessity, already angling her body toward the left side of the cabin. When her eyes landed on row 2, her muscles tensed almost imperceptibly. Seat 2A, her seat, held a person she did not expect to see there, a middle-aged black woman in a plain sweater, gazing quietly out the window as if she had all the right in the world to be there. Catherine stopped with one hand still on the handle of her bag. For a few seconds, the aisle behind her had to adjust, people waiting without understanding why the flow had paused. "I am sorry," she said at last, her tone light but edged. "I think you may be in my seat." Evelyn turned her head, her expression polite. "This is 2A, is that right?" she asked calmly. "Yes," Catherine replied, "and I am always in 2A on this route." The words were simple, delivered with the relaxed certainty of someone who has been recognized and favored many times. Underneath, though, there was an unspoken assumption that the patterns of the past should dictate the present. Evelyn reached into the pocket in front of her and took out the boarding pass, holding it so the numbers and letters faced outward. "My ticket shows first class, seat 2A, she said. "I checked it at the gate." Catherine leaned closer, but instead of reading the print, she gave the paper only a brief glance, as if the details were less important than the larger story she already believed. "The system has been doing a lot of automatic upgrades lately," she said, a small smile that did not reach her eyes touching her mouth. "Sometimes it puts people in these seats by mistake. It can be very confusing." The phrase hung between them. People. Confusing. Evelyn felt the familiar prickling under her skin, the old awareness that her presence in certain spaces always seemed to surprise someone. She had heard versions of that sentence before,
in other cities, with other uniforms, explanations that treated her as an error to be quietly corrected. "I printed this at the kiosk myself," Evelyn replied. "The agent confirmed it. You may want to ask them to check the list." Before Catherine could answer, Mark appeared at her side, drawn by the slight logjam in the aisle. He took in the scene at a glance. Catherine, first-class regular, paused beside row 2, Evelyn seated at the window, a couple of passengers behind waiting with polite impatience. "Miss Reynolds," he said, smile brightening, "good to see you again. Let me help you with that." She tipped her head toward him with the ease of familiarity. "Hi, Mark," she said. "We have a little mix-up. I think there was a mistake with my seat. You know I am usually in 2A. He turned to Evelyn, still smiling, but now wearing the careful expression of someone delivering unwanted news. "Let me take a look at your boarding pass, ma'am," he said. She handed it to him without hesitation. He read it, his brows flicking together for a heartbeat before smoothing out again. "All right," he said, in a tone meant to sound reassuring. "It looks like the system put you in 2A. We have another excellent seat available just a little farther back in the cabin. If you would not mind moving, we can keep things running on time for everyone."
It sounded reasonable on the surface. The words "excellent seat" and "for everyone" were chosen with care. But the message beneath them was simple. You move, not the person I recognize. Evelyn studied his face. She had watched men like him navigate countless small crises in the air, smoothing ruffled feelings, rearranging trays and travelers. She respected the skill. What she did not respect was the assumption that her ticket, clearly marked, was more flexible than someone else's preference. "I chose this seat when I booked," she said, her voice still even. "I would like to keep it. Perhaps the gate can review the assignments." Behind Mark's shoulder, Isabel stood with a stack of service items balanced in her arms. She had heard enough of the exchange to feel a tighten in her chest. She had seen this pattern before too, even if she had not always had the words for it. A stranger, dressed simply, asked to give way to someone who fit the cabin like a glove. Mark's jaw tightened a fraction. "I understand, ma'am," he said, though his tone suggested impatience creeping in. "But we are close to departure. It will be much easier if you take the other seat. Ms. Reynolds here flies with us all the time. She has certain expectations for her experience, and we try to accommodate our loyal customers." Evelyn felt the emphasis land. Loyal customers. Expectations. Accommodate. As if her own loyalty did not count. As if her years of building the airline had no weight compared to a familiar face at the bar in the lounge. "Your system gave me this seat," she said quietly. "I am only asking that you honor what is on the ticket you issued." Catherine exhaled through her nose, a sound that was not quite a sigh. "I do not want to make a big deal out of this," she interjected, "but this is the seat I use to work. I have calls to prepare for, and I need the space and quiet. Surely there is a way to fix this without slowing everyone down." Her eyes flicked over Evelyn again, taking in the absence of briefcase, blazer, polished laptop. The unspoken judgment settled around them. 2 rows back, in the first row of the main cabin, Tyler shifted in his seat. His attention had drifted from the safety card in his hands to the rising tension at the front of the cabin. He could not hear every word, but he caught enough. The repeated mention of mistake, the careful, strained politeness in the man's voice, the undercurrent in the woman's. He had filmed plenty of silly things on flights before, little turbulent scares and funny announcements. This felt different. He slid his phone out of his hoodie pocket and placed it face down on his leg, thumb resting near the side button. He told himself he was only being prepared, just in case. "Is there a problem?" a passenger across the aisle asked quietly, leaning toward the aisle just enough to show concern without fully involving herself. "Everything is fine," Mark replied quickly. That word again, fine, used as a seal to press the situation flat. He turned back to Evelyn, the smile gone now, replaced by something firmer.
"Ma'am, I am asking you one more time, please," he said. "Take the other seat so we can depart on time." Isabel shifted her weight. The other seat Mark mentioned was not terrible, but it was at the far end of the cabin, closer to the galley and the noise. She knew from experience that they did not offer it to Ms. Reynolds unless the cabin was nearly full. Loyalty, in practice, meant always having the best choice. Evelyn's thoughts flickered through old images. A younger version of herself being told to move to the back of a bus? A hotel clerk insisting there were no rooms left after seeing her face? A gate agent casually announcing that her upgrade had been reassigned? She had told herself over the years that things were getting better, that the world was learning. Yet here she was again, boarding pass in hand, watching the same old story play out with new uniforms. She could feel eyes on her from a few directions, people half watching, half pretending not to see. No one wanted trouble. No one wanted to miss their connection because of a stranger's stand. She understood that. She also knew that silence, repeated often enough, built walls. She folded her hands in her lap, grounding herself in the feel of the fabric beneath her palms. "I understand your concern about the schedule," she said. "I am not trying to cause a delay. I am simply sitting in the seat that was assigned to me. If there is an error, perhaps we can resolve it by checking your system." For a moment, Mark considered it. He could call the gate, ask them to pull up the list, confirm who had which seat first. It would take a few minutes. It might reveal that someone, at some point, had promised something they should not have promised. It might annoy the person who was used to sliding into 2A without questions.
He looked instead at Catherine, who raised her brows as if to say, "Are you really going to make this complicated?" His decision settled. "Miss Reynolds has flown with us for years," he repeated, as if that single fact answered everything. "We have a way we usually arrange things for her. I am sure you can understand that." Isabel's fingers tightened around the stack of napkins in her arms. Tyler's thumb pressed lightly against the side of his phone, not yet committing. For a brief second, Evelyn felt again the temptation to stand up, to shrug and move, to let the moment pass rather than widen into something bigger. She imagined the sighs of relief, the quick adjustment of luggage, the way everyone's shoulders would drop once the small disruption had been cleared away. Then she thought of her granddaughter in the kitchen in Queens, flour on her nose, holding a pie with both hands. She thought of the elders whose names would be invoked tomorrow at the community center in Harlem, people who had stood in doorways and on bridges and at lunch counters because someone had told them they did not belong. She lifted her chin very slightly. "This ticket is also loyalty," she said softly, "just a different kind." Mark exhaled, the last of his patience fraying. "If you do not cooperate, we will have to call security to handle this, and the flight will be delayed because of you," Mark said, his voice low but full of threat. Evelyn looked him straight in the eye and answered that she would not leave her seat until they checked the ticket properly. The moment froze on Tyler's phone screen as he tightened his grip and pressed the record button. The words hung in the air long after they were spoken, as if they had been taped to the cabin walls. For a heartbeat, no one moved. The low buzz of conversation that had filled first class a few minutes earlier had gone thin and brittle. Somewhere behind them, a compartment door clicked shut, but even that small sound seemed out of place. Evelyn sat very still in seat 2A, her hands folded loosely over the smooth fabric of her slacks. She could feel the wake of the man's threat pressing on her chest, not because she believed he could strip her of anything that truly mattered, but because she knew how quickly a story could be twisted once security and accusation entered the frame. She had seen it happen before, to people who shared her skin, her history, her quiet refusal to disappear. Mark Phillips straightened, as if he had just placed a final card on a fragile house and expected everything to tumble the way he had planned. His jaw was tight, his shoulders a little too square. He had not raised his voice, but there was no mistaking the line he had drawn. Cooperate or become the problem. Catherine Reynolds shifted her weight from one heel to the other, impatience heating her expression. She glanced back along the aisle at the rows of passengers now watching more openly. The last thing she wanted was to become a spectacle, and yet here she was, held in place by a woman who did not seem to understand how things were supposed to work. "It should not be this complicated," Catherine murmured, pitching her voice so that it sounded reasonable, even wounded. "We are all just trying to get where we are going." Evelyn turned her head slowly, meeting her eyes. She heard the words, and under them she heard something else entirely. "We are. Not you." She had spent so many years learning to read those layers. In boardrooms, in interviews, in quiet side conversations after public events. There were people who could hold two contradictory thoughts in their heads at once: that they believed in fairness, and that certain places belonged more naturally to certain faces. When forced to choose, they often protected their comfort first. "I am trying to get where I am going as well," Evelyn said. Her voice was calm, low, the kind that carried not by volume but by steadiness. "I am only asking to keep the seat your system gave me." 2 rows back, Tyler's phone captured the set of her shoulders, the stillness in her hands, the tension in the line of Mark's mouth. Comments began to trickle across the small screen that only he could see. At first, they were simple questions. "What is going on? Where are you? Is this for real?" He did not answer any of them. He was recording to entertain. He was recording because his gut told him that whatever was happening should not disappear with the closing of the cabin door. Across from him, an older man shifted uneasily in his seat, glancing between the front of the cabin and the safety pamphlet in his lap. He had lived another era, one in which people had been dragged from lunch counters and bus seats for far less than refusing to move. He had hoped those days were gone. Now, watching the familiar tension building 3 rows ahead, he felt an echo of the old fear in his bones. Isabel stood frozen near the galley, a neatly folded stack of napkins pressed too tightly in her hands. She had been trying to count the service items, to stay busy with the 1,000 small tasks that made a flight seem smooth, but the words "call security" had reached right through her professional habits and shaken something loose. Her mother had told her stories about the first time she had been stopped and questioned for no reason in a parking lot, about the way fear could suddenly flood an ordinary afternoon. The idea that her work could be the setting for someone else's version of that story made Isabel's stomach knot. Mark inhaled, then spoke again, this time looking not only at Evelyn but at the passengers within earshot. "We have a schedule to keep," he said. "Everyone here has connections, meetings, families. I cannot let one person's refusal to cooperate hold this flight hostage." The word hostage slid off his tongue and settled over the row like a shadow. It was the kind of word that could turn sympathy into suspicion in an instant. A few passengers stiffened. No one wanted to be on a flight where someone was described that way. Evelyn heard it and let it sit for a moment. There it was, the quiet shift she had expected. From passenger to obstacle, from customer to problem. She had watched similar shifts happen to people in board reports and media stories, where a complaint about treatment became aggressive behavior, where a request for fairness became disruption. She felt the eyes again, the weight of expectation that she should be the one to bend, to smooth things over, to make everyone else comfortable. For much of her life, she had done exactly that. There were certain doors she had walked away from rather than walk through because the cost of forcing them open alone would have been more than she could bear at the time. Now, though, she was not alone. She had a granddaughter waiting with a flour-dusted pie miles away. She had a room full of elders and young entrepreneurs preparing to share space with her the next day in Harlem. She had her own years of work poured into the very brand printed on the napkins Isabel held. "If you are going to call security," she said at last, "then please do so. I will wait here. When they arrive, I will tell them exactly what has been said and done." Her tone was almost gentle, but it carried a promise that none of them could mistake. She was not going to shout. She was not going to stand in the aisle and wave her arms.
She was going to sit in the seat she had been assigned and require them to bring witnesses into the light. Catherine's mouth opened, then closed again. She had not expected that answer. She had expected either capitulation or noisy outrage. There was something unnerving about a person who met threat with a simple invitation to transparency. "You see," she said to Mark, turning slightly to include the nearby passengers. "She is making this into a scene." Behind her, the murmur of the cabin changed shape. It was no longer just the background hum of people settling in. It had become a low, uneasy chorus of whispered commentary, shifting loyalties, quiet calculations. Some faces showed annoyance, others showed worry. A few, like the older man in the first row of economy, showed a deep, worn sadness. Mark's throat felt dry. This was not how he liked things to go. A neat solution would have been best: a quick apology, a switch of seats, a glass of sparkling water delivered with an extra smile to smooth any lingering roughness. Instead, he found himself on the edge of something he did not understand and certainly did not want in his cabin. "Fine," he said, the word coming out sharper than he intended. "Stay where you are for now. I will have someone from security come on board and talk to you. If they ask you to leave this seat, I expect you to comply. Do you understand?" Evelyn nodded once. "I understand that I will explain the situation to them," she replied. He did not trust himself to answer that. He turned abruptly and moved down the aisle, signaling to one of the other attendants to follow him toward the front. The cabin watched him go. The sudden movement of his shoulders, the stiff set of his back, told anyone who was paying attention that he was not as in control as he wanted to appear. For a few beats, the space he left behind was strangely quiet. Then, ordinary sounds began to filter back in, unsure and thin at first. A cough, the rustle of a page turned, the soft ding of a call button pressed by someone who decided at that exact moment that they needed a glass of water. Evelyn let out a breath she had not realized she was holding. Her heart was beating a little faster than usual, but her hands were steady. She looked down at them as if checking, surprised to find them so calm. Years earlier, in her 20s, in her 30s, her fingers would have trembled after a confrontation like this. She would have replayed every word, every look, second-guessing herself. Now, with decades behind her, something had shifted.
The fear was still there, but it had been joined by an older companion, resolve. She could feel her parents in the back of her mind. Her father, who had once been made to leave a hotel lobby because he was told his presence made other guests uncomfortable. Her mother, who had been passed over for a promotion because a manager said the customers were not used to seeing someone like her in charge. They did not get the chance to sit in first class on an airline with a name they had helped inspire. She did. On the other side of the aisle, a woman in a crisp pantsuit leaned forward slightly. "Are you all right?" she asked quietly, her voice just loud enough for the nearest rows to hear. Evelyn turned toward her, acknowledging her with a small nod. "I will," she said. "Thank you." The simple exchange seemed to loosen something in the air. Another passenger, a man with a wedding ring and a weary expression, shifted in his seat, clearly weighing whether to say anything. In the end, he looked away, choosing silence. It was easier. He told himself it was not his business. His children were waiting at home. He did not want trouble. Tyler's camera continued to record. He tried to keep his hands steady, bracing his elbows against the armrests. His heart thudded in his chest. He had not meant to become the chronicler of someone else's trial on an ordinary travel day, but now that he had started, he could not bring himself to stop. In the galley, near the front door, Mark picked up the interphone and dialed the code that reached the gate agent. His voice, filtered through the small speaker, was clipped and efficient as he explained that he needed an airport security officer to come on board. His words framed the situation in a particular way. A passenger refusing to comply, a potential safety issue, a delay if not handled quickly. The gate agent listened, said they would contact security, then asked how much time they had before they would have to release the slot. Mark gave a tight answer, naming a window he hoped would be enough.
When he hung up, he caught his own reflection in the small metal panel near the door. For a fleeting moment, he saw not professionalism, but something more raw, the face of a man who had just chosen the path of least resistance for himself, even if it meant placing someone else under a harsher light. Isabel came forward, her brows knit. "Is there nothing else we can do?" she asked softly. "We could check the manifest. Maybe there is a way to switch without involving security." He shook his head, already closing himself off. "The time for that has passed," he said. "We have to show we are in control of the cabin. If we give in every time someone refuses to follow instructions, we will never get off the ground." "But she just asked to keep the seat on her ticket," Isabel replied. "She did not raise her voice. She did not threaten anyone." "Not yet," he said. "These things can escalate quickly. You have seen the videos." She felt the sting of that, the way he invoked unseen clips from the internet as justification. She thought of her own mother, once described as difficult in a memo for having asked why her hours were being cut while someone else's were not. She looked past Mark toward the cabin, where Evelyn sat like a single stone in the middle of anxious glances. "People will see this too," Isabel murmured, so quietly that he did not catch it. Out beyond the open doorway of the aircraft, the jet bridge stretched like a concrete tunnel back toward the terminal. The air there was cooler, carrying a faint echo of footsteps, rolling suitcases, muffled conversations. For now, the bridge directly in front of the aircraft remained mostly empty. The flow of boarding had slowed to a trickle as the last few passengers found their seats. The plane itself seemed to be holding its breath. Engine silent, nose pointed toward the closed wall at the end of the gate, it sat waiting, its metal skin reflecting the stark fluorescent lights of the boarding area. Inside, the passengers were caught in a kind of suspended animation, neither fully on their way, nor still safely in the terminal. Evelyn's gaze drifted toward the front, toward the open space where the jet bridge met the threshold of the plane. She couldn't see very far past the doorway, only a gray blur and the indistinct shapes of rails and walls. Still, she listened, the way someone listens in the quiet moments before a storm, attuned to the slightest change in the air. She thought of what she would say when the officer arrived. Not about who she was on paper, not at first, but about what had been said to her here, in this narrow space at 30,000 feet's future promise. She would describe the assumption that she must be the mistake, not the system. She would repeat the words about loyalty and expectation. She would not dress them up. She would let them stand as they were spoken.
If she was honest, a part of her still wished that something would shift before it came to that Mark would return, chastened, with an apology and a simple acknowledgement that the seat on the boarding pass would be respected, that Catherine would move without further comment, taking the other excellent seat and perhaps learning something quiet and unspoken by doing so, that the plane could leave the gate with everyone a little wiser and no official report filed. But another part of her knew that change rarely came so gently. People who had grown comfortable with certain arrangements did not often step away from them without being prompted, sometimes sharply, by the truth. The overhead speakers crackled softly as the gate agent announced a slight delay due to a matter being resolved on board. The words were bland and carefully chosen, but they sent another ripple through the cabin. Some passengers sighed, checked their watches, opened their phones to send quick messages to contacts waiting on the other side. A few glared toward the front, as if the delay itself were a verdict. Then, faint at first but unmistakable, came the sound of heavy footsteps entering the far end of the jet bridge. The rhythm was measured and firm, each step bringing whoever made it closer to the open door of the plane. The children in the cabin fell quiet. Conversations faded again. People turned their heads toward the front, toward the place where the soft carpet of the jet bridge would end and the metal threshold of the aircraft would begin. The plane remained motionless at the gate, 100 small eyes glancing toward the front in a silence thick enough to press against the skin. From the far end of the cabin, the heavy, steady sound of footsteps moved closer along the jet bridge toward the open aircraft door, carrying with it the knowledge that security had indeed been called, and that someone was about to step inside and ask whose story would be believed. The first thing that crossed the threshold was the shine of a badge, catching the cabin light as the man stepped through the aircraft door. The heavy footsteps that had sounded in the jet bridge resolved into a steady, measured walk down the short doorway and into first class. He filled the entrance without needing to raise his voice, his presence alone making people sit a little straighter. The airport security officer was not tall enough to be intimidating by size alone, but there was a quiet authority in the way he held himself. His uniform was pressed, his shoes polished to a muted sheen, his radio sitting on his belt like an extra heartbeat. His eyes swept the rows once, taking in the faces, the tension, the way conversations had collapsed into silence. He introduced himself simply. "My name is Sergeant Marcus Hill," he said. "I understand there is a situation regarding a seat assignment." She sat as she had before, hands resting on her lap, boarding pass visible on the tray table in front of her. Her posture was composed, not slack with defiance, not hunched with guilt. On her face, he saw neither hostility nor submission, only the steady watchfulness of someone who had been here, or somewhere very much like here, before. "Ma'am," he said, keeping his tone as neutral with her as he had with the others, "could you tell me your understanding of what is going on?" She met his gaze, and in that brief meeting he saw the fine lines at the corners of her eyes, the kind that come from years of squinting into both sunlight and doubt. "My boarding pass shows first-class seat 2A," she said. "I was directed here by the gate agent and seated myself. After I sat down, Ms. Reynolds arrived and said this was her usual seat. The flight attendant asked me to move so she could sit here. I asked that they check the system and honor what is printed on my ticket." Marcus's eyes dropped to the paper on the tray. The numbers and letters on it matched what she had said. Seat 2A. Her name, first class. He straightened again. "Did anyone check the computer at the gate when you raised this?" he asked Mark. Mark's jaw worked for a moment. "We are close to departure," he replied. "Stopping to call the gate and redo assignments would delay everyone. I made a judgment call to ask her to move since Ms. Reynolds is a frequent premium customer." "So no one has actually confirmed that her assignment is incorrect?" Marcus said. It was not quite a question. The flight attendant hesitated, and that small pause spoke as loudly as any admission. In the first row of economy, the older man watched this exchange with a careful attention he had not given anything else that morning. He recognized the shape of it. He had seen, many times, how an assumption could harden into a story simply because it had been spoken first and with confidence. Before Marcus could say more, a quiet voice came from behind him. "Sergeant," Tyler called, lifting his phone slightly. "I have a video of what they said to her, if you want to see it." Every head that had been pretending not to look at him turned in an instant. Mark felt a cold line trace down his spine. Catherine's stomach dropped. Isabel, still near the galley, exhaled in a soundless sigh of both fear and relief. There it was, the truth outside of memory, caught in pixels and sound. Marcus regarded the young man for a moment. "Where are you sitting?" he asked. "Row 4, on the left," Tyler answered. "I started recording when things seemed off. I did not know what would happen, but I thought someone should see it." "Come forward, please," Marcus said. "We will take a look." Tyler unbuckled, heart hammering, and walked up the aisle with the shy stiffness of someone unused to this kind of attention. He held the phone out, screen glowing, the small image of the paused video showing the interior of the same cabin from his earlier vantage point. Marcus took the device carefully, as if it were evidence in a case, which, in a way, it now was. He tapped to play. Out of the speaker spilled the scene from a few minutes earlier. Mark's smiling insistence, Catherine's comments, Evelyn's measured responses. The audio caught the exact phrase Catherine had used, the one that had made a few passengers flinch even then. "Sometimes the system puts people in these seats by mistake," her recorded voice said. The emphasis on people was unmistakable now, no longer softened by distance.
The video also captured Mark brushing aside the suggestion to check the computer. His repeated focus on loyalty and expectations for one customer over another. No raised voices, no obvious slurs, but enough to show the pattern. Who was assumed to belong, who was assumed to be the error. Marcus watched the clip twice, his expression hardly changing, but the set of his shoulders tightening slightly with each replay. Around him, the cabin listened to their own words thrown back at them in the thin, tinny audio from a stranger's phone. He handed the device back to Tyler. "Thank you," he said simply. "Please return to your seat, but do not delete that video." Tyler nodded, relief and nerves tangling together in his chest, and retreated to row 4. Comments still flickered across his screen. Some viewers were outraged. Some were skeptical. All of them now shared the image of the quiet woman in seat 2A and the man in uniform weighing what he had just seen. Marcus turned then to Isabel, who had been hovering in the space between the galley and the aisle, wanting to disappear and wanting to be called on at the same time. "You were present for this conversation?" he asked her. She swallowed. "Yes, Sergeant," she answered. "Did you hear anything that made you uncomfortable?" he continued. "Including anything that might suggest this passenger was being treated differently because of her appearance rather than her ticket."
The question gave her an opening, but it also gave her a choice. She could take the safe path, speak in generalities, echo the official phrasing, or she could name what she had felt prickling in her skin since the first moment she heard it. She glanced at Evelyn, met her eyes. In that brief connection, she saw not a demand, but an invitation to honesty. "I heard Miss Reynolds say that some people did not look like they belonged in first class," Isabel said, each word chosen carefully. "I heard Mr. Phillips suggest that the system had upgraded the wrong kind of customer and that it would be better if this lady moved. It did not sound right to me, but he is my supervisor. I did not think I could contradict him." Mark bristled. "That is not what I said," he protested. "I was talking about the practical side of our seating, not about what anyone looks like." "You mentioned loyalty and expectations," Marcus replied. "You did not mention the boarding pass in front of you. You chose to ask this passenger to move instead of the one you know by name." The security officer's voice was still calm, but a steel edge had crept into it. He had seen this pattern as well, though not always in airplanes. In shops, in waiting rooms, outside apartment buildings. Polite phrases covering over a deeper imbalance. He shifted his attention back to Evelyn. "Ma'am," he said, "I would like to see your boarding pass and your identification, please." She slid the ticket toward him and reached into her bag for her wallet. From it, she produced a driver's license and something else. A card she had not planned to show when she left home that morning. She set them both beside the boarding pass. Marcus picked up the license first, confirming that the name matched the one on the ticket. Then his eyes fell on the other card. It was not a credit card or a frequent flyer membership. It was branded with the same blue sky logo that decorated the napkins and the headrest covers, but the text below it was different. He read the words once, then again, to be sure he had not imagined them. Chairwoman, Board of Directors, Blue Sky Airways. He looked up at her, the pieces shifting into place in a way that made his earlier neutrality feel thin. "Miss Carter," he said, using her name now with a new weight, "is this position current?" "Yes," she answered. "I do not usually travel with that card. Today I brought it for a separate meeting. I had hoped it would stay in my bag." A murmur moved through the cabin like a breeze through tall grass. Passengers exchanged looks. Kate felt heat rise to her face, then drain away, leaving her lightheaded. Mark's mouth went dry. The woman they had framed to security as non-compliant was, in fact, the highest authority in the entire company. Marcus took a slow breath. He had dealt with high-profile travelers before, people who believed their status placed them above rules. This did not feel like that. This felt like something else entirely. A test of the system from the inside, one the system had just failed in a very public way.
He straightened, then turned to include both crew and nearby passengers in what he said next. "Based on the documentation in front of me," he announced, "Seat 2A is correctly assigned to Miss Evelyn Carter. There is no security reason for her to move. Any request that she do so is a customer service issue, not a safety issue." He let that settle. It was a small correction on paper, but in the charged air of the first-class cabin, it was a rebalancing of the entire moment. "So you are saying she can stay where she is?" the woman in the pantsuit across the aisle clarified, a note of relief in her voice. "Yes, ma'am," Marcus replied. "She has every right to remain in the seat printed on her boarding pass." Catherine stared at him as if he had failed to understand something. "And what about me?" she asked, her voice tight. "What about my loyalty? What about my loyalty?" Marcus regarded her evenly. "Your loyalty is appreciated, I am sure," he said, "but it does not override another passenger's valid ticket, nor does it allow anyone to imply that someone does not belong in a cabin because of how they look." The words landed with careful force. No shouting, no dramatic gestures, but a line drawn just as clearly as the one Mark had tried to draw earlier, now running in a very different direction. Evelyn watched the faces around her. Some looked away, unable to meet her eyes. Others held her gaze for a second, offering small wordless acknowledgments. Isabel's shoulders dropped a little, as if a weight she had been afraid to name had just been taken off the shelf. Mark seemed to shrink in his uniform. The structure he had relied on, the invisible hierarchy of whom mattered more, had been exposed under the worst possible spotlight, in front of a cabin full of witnesses and a recording lens he could no longer control. "Based on the documentation in front of me," he announced, "Seat 2A is correctly assigned to Miss Evelyn Carter. There is no security reason for her to move. Any request that she do so is a customer service issue, not a safety issue." He let that settle. It was a small correction on paper, but in the charged air of the first-class cabin, it was a rebalancing of the entire moment. "So you are saying she can stay where she is?" the woman in the pantsuit across the aisle clarified, a note of relief in her voice. "Yes, ma'am," Marcus replied. "She has every right to remain in the seat printed on her boarding pass." Catherine stared at him as if he had failed to understand something. "And what about me?" she asked, her voice tight. "What about my loyalty?" Marcus regarded her evenly. "Your loyalty is appreciated, I am sure," he said, "but it does not override another passenger's valid ticket, nor does it allow anyone to imply that someone does not belong in a cabin because of how they look." The words landed with careful force. No shouting, no dramatic gestures, but a line drawn just as clearly as the one Mark had tried to draw earlier, now running in a very different direction. Evelyn watched the faces around her. Some looked away, unable to meet her eyes. Others held her gaze for a second, offering small wordless acknowledgments. Isabel's shoulders dropped a little, as if a weight she had been afraid to name had just been taken off the shelf. Mark seemed to shrink in his uniform. The structure he had relied on, the invisible hierarchy of whom mattered more, had been exposed under the worst spotlight, in front of a cabin full of witnesses and a recording lens he could no longer control.
"Sergeant," he said, reaching for something to hold on to, "we still have to think about timing. If we delay too much—" "If the flight is delayed," Marcus interrupted gently, "it will be because crew actions required security involvement, not because this passenger insisted on what her ticket guarantees. That distinction matters." The officer's radio crackled softly on his belt, a distant voice asking for a status update. He pressed the button, spoke a few quiet words confirming that there was no active threat, only a resolved seating issue, and that the aircraft could continue preparations for departure once internal matters were addressed. Then he turned back to Evelyn one last time. "Miss Carter," he said, "do you feel safe to continue on this flight, or would you prefer to deplane and handle this elsewhere?" There was no sarcasm in the question, no hint that he thought she was overreacting. He asked it as someone who had seen what happened when people were pressured to stay in spaces that had just hurt them. She considered it. For a moment she imagined standing, collecting her bag, walking back through the jet bridge and into the terminal air, leaving behind this narrow room with its stale tension. She imagined the headlines that might follow, the internal emails, the statements. She imagined also the look on her granddaughter's face when she did not appear at the door that evening. "I will stay," she said, "but only if what has happened here is not treated as a misunderstanding and then forgotten." Marcus nodded. That same steady acknowledgement he had given her at the beginning, now colored with deeper respect. "That is up to the airline to address," he replied. "You have my report on what I have seen and heard." He gave a small, almost invisible nod to Isabel, a silent recognition of her courage, then stepped back toward the front. At the doorway he paused, looking once more down the length of the cabin, as if imprinting the scene in his mind. Then he was gone, his footsteps retreating up the jet bridge, leaving behind an echo that was more about what he had rebalanced than about the sound itself. The silence that followed was different from the one that had preceded his arrival. Before, people had held their breath out of fear and anticipation. Now they held it because they realized, perhaps for the first time that day, that they had been witnesses to more than a minor inconvenience. A story had just shifted in their presence, and they would carry a piece of it with them when they left the plane. Mark stood rooted in the aisle, at a loss for the next step. The script he usually followed in such moments had not prepared him for the revelation that the woman he had tried to push aside was not only in the right, but at the very top of the company whose name was stitched onto his chest. Evelyn could feel the weight of his uncertainty pressing into the narrow space. She might have let him flounder. Instead, she chose to speak, her voice still calm, her hands still resting lightly on her knees. "I would like to make a request," she said, addressing him but using a tone that invited the whole cabin to listen. "And I want it to be on the record." He swallowed. "What kind of request?" he asked. "I want this incident documented formally," she answered, "not as a simple delay, not as a vague passenger issue, but a situation in which a customer with a valid first-class ticket was asked to surrender her seat to another passenger because of assumptions about who belongs where." Her words were precise, the kind that would sit neatly in a statement, difficult to soften without being obviously altered. "I also want to speak with the highest-ranking legal officer at Blue Sky before this plane leaves the gate," she continued, "not through an assistant, not as a general complaint funneled into a system, but directly, from someone who has just experienced how our policies are being lived out in this cabin." Mark opened his mouth, then closed it again. He had no protocol for this. He knew there was a legal department somewhere behind the curtain of corporate structure, but he had never been asked to call them from a plane at the gate, much less at the instruction of the person who led the board. Catherine sat rigid in her seat, the blood drained from her face. She could feel the ground shifting under her heels, the safe assumption that the airline would always back her preferences beginning to crumble. For the first time, she truly saw the woman by the window. Not as an obstacle, not as a mistake, but as someone whose story ran deeper than this single moment. In row 4, Tyler looked at the livestream stats on his phone. The number of people watching was climbing, the tiny counter jumping in quick increments as more viewers joined, shared, and commented. He sensed that whatever happened next would matter, not just to the woman in the window seat, but to a lot of people who would see themselves in her place. Somewhere near the front of the cabin, a small screen used for safety announcements and occasional messages flickered to life. The Blue Sky logo appeared for a second, then shrank to the corner as a familiar video call interface took its place. A name sat at the center of the display, the letters stark against the pale background, waiting for the connection to go through. Evelyn, her voice still level, asked Sergeant Hill to have an official report opened on what appeared to be discriminatory treatment and requested to speak with the highest legal officer at Blue Sky right there on the aircraft. Mark stood frozen, Kate's face drained of color, and Tyler stared at his phone as the viewer count climbed, while on the front bulkhead monitor, the video call screen glowed with a single name ringing through: Linda Parker. The conference room at Blue Sky headquarters was all glass and quiet, the kind of space designed to project calm control. Outside, the floor-to-ceiling windows, the runways stretched toward the horizon, streaked with taxi lines and the slow movement of aircraft noses turning toward the sky.
Inside, the only sound for a long moment was the soft hum of the projector hanging from the ceiling. On the far wall, frozen in mid-frame, a grainy image from a mobile phone showed the inside of a first-class cabin. A woman in a simple dark sweater sat by the window, hands resting calmly on her knees. A flight attendant stood over her, jaw tight, one hand braced on the seat back. In the aisle, a well-dressed passenger watched with faint irritation creasing her face. It was a still shot, but everyone in the room knew exactly how it moved and sounded when the video played. Linda Parker stood near the screen with a remote in her hand. The light from the image washed over the front of her blazer, turning the dark fabric into a mottled canvas. Her eyes were on the board members seated around the long table, not on the picture. "So," she said quietly, "this is the version the public has already seen." She pressed a button. The image came to life, sound spilling from the speakers. The cabin voices, distorted slightly by the phone microphone, filled the polished room. There was the strained politeness in the crew member's tone, the smooth certainty in the passenger's insistence, the measured responses from the woman in seat 2A. There was no shouting, no vulgarity, just a steady drip of assumptions and refusals, culminating in the officer's measured statement that the seat belonged to the woman who had been asked to move. Robert Mitchell sat near the middle of the table, hands clasped loosely in front of him. As the clip played, he glanced toward Evelyn, who sat at the head of the table, her profile turned toward the moving picture. Her face was composed, but he had known her long enough to see the tension in the small muscles at her jaw. Around them, other directors watched with varying degrees of discomfort. Some had already seen the video on their phones the day after the flight, when the clip began to spread online. Others were seeing it for the first time on this larger screen, the details magnified, the tone impossible to ignore. When the video ended, Linda pressed pause on the last frame and turned fully toward the table. "As of this morning," she said, "that video has been viewed several 100,000 times across different platforms. It is being shared with captions that describe the incident as discrimination in first class. People are tagging Blue Sky and asking what we intend to do about it." The number she quoted came out as words, not digits, yet the weight of it still settled on the room. Several 100,000 people, all invited to make up their own minds about what they had seen. "We also have," she continued, "a formal complaint filed by Miss Carter, in her capacity as a passenger, regarding the treatment she received on Flight 417. There was a small dry humor in the way she separated those roles, Miss Carter the passenger, and Miss Carter the chairwoman now leading the meeting. It was a delicate balancing act, but they all knew it was necessary. If this were treated as a mere internal embarrassment, it would say one thing. If it were treated as what it looked like on the screen, it would say another." Evelyn finally exhaled, the sound quiet enough that only those closest to her heard it. "Thank you, Linda," she said. "Let us hear from the crew." A knock at the glass door broke the tension. An assistant opened it just enough to allow two people to step in. Isabel Cruz, in a businesslike blouse and slacks instead of her uniform dress, and Mark Phillips, still in navy, but without the bright polish he usually carried. He looked as if he had not slept well. "Please, have a seat," Linda said, indicating two chairs near the end of the table. Isabel sat on the edge of her chair, fingers laced together tightly in her lap. Mark sat back stiffly, shoulders squared, eyes fixed on some invisible point in the middle distance.
"We have reviewed the flight report you filed," Linda said to him, "and we have all watched the video from another passenger. We would like to hear, in your own words, how you believe the situation arose." He cleared his throat. "First of all, I want to say that I never intended to disrespect Miss Carter," he began. "I was trying to handle a seating conflict quickly so the flight would not be delayed. Ms. Reynolds is a very frequent flyer. She is used to being in that seat. When I saw the assignment, I assumed there had been a last-minute upgrade or error, and I asked the other passenger to move to another first-class seat so that everyone would be satisfied and we could depart on time." "You assumed," Robert repeated gently. "Did you check the manifest or call the gate to confirm that assumption?" Mark hesitated.
No, sir, he said. We were close to our departure time. I thought it would cause more delay to involve the gate. Linda did not raise her voice, but there was a new firmness in it when she spoke next. You thought it would cause more delay to involve the gate, she said, but you did choose to involve airport security. That decision resulted in a delay, and in a video that now has hundreds of thousands of viewers. Mark's cheeks flushed. At that point, he said, I was concerned about compliance. I used the procedures we are taught. If someone refuses crew instructions, security may need to intervene. What instruction was she refusing? Evelyn asked quietly. To sit in the seat shown on her boarding pass? He looked at her then, really looked, and the full weight of who she was pressed into his awareness. You are the chairwoman, he said, voice dropping, as if the fact had only now become real in this particular room. On that day, she replied, I was a woman with a ticket and a seat, being told to surrender it to someone whose comfort you valued more than my rights. We are discussing that woman today, not my title. The room was very still. Outside the glass, a blue sky aircraft lifted off the runway, its nose rising slowly, the wheels tucking away. The image hung behind Evelyn like an illustration of the company's stated values and the reality they had just witnessed. Linda turned to Isabel. Miss Cruz, she said, you were present for much of this interaction. We have read your written statement. Please tell the board, in your own words, what you observed and how it felt to you at the time. Isabel swallowed hard. Her accent carried traces of her childhood, a soft music under her careful English. I saw Miss Carter sit down in the seat on her ticket, she said. I saw Miss Reynolds arrive and insist that it was her usual seat. When Mr. Phillips came, he looked at Mr. Reynolds and greeted her by name. He did not greet Miss Carter this way. He suggested that Miss Carter move to another first-class seat so that Miss Reynolds could be comfortable. She paused, gathering courage. He said the system was doing a lot of upgrades lately, she continued. He did not want to call the gate to check. When Miss Carter refused, he mentioned calling security. I remember feeling wrong about it. Not just because of the seat, but because of the way he talked about Miss Reynolds as loyal and expected, and about Miss Carter as someone the system had accidentally allowed into the wrong place. No one spoke over her. The board members let the words settle, the picture she painted filling in spaces even the video had not shown. Did you raise your concerns at the time? No, Isabel said, shame flushing her face. He is my supervisor. I did not think anyone would listen. I am sorry for that. Evelyn shook her head gently. Your honesty now matters, she said. That is why you are here. Thank you, Isabel whispered. There was a chime from the center of the table as the conference speakerphone lit up, indicating a remote participant. Linda tapped a button. Tyler, can you hear us? She asked. A young man's voice came through, slightly flattened by the connection, but still clear. Yes, ma'am, he replied. I am here. Thank you for joining, she said. We appreciate you taking the time. We have seen the video you posted. We would like to hear why you chose to record and share it. He exhaled audibly on the line, then began. At first, I was just curious, he said. I have seen small arguments on planes before. They usually end quickly. But the way the attendant talked to the lady by the window, it felt different. It sounded like he was saying she did not really belong where she was. It reminded me of stories my parents told me, about being treated like they were in the wrong place, even when they had the same tickets and papers as everyone else. He paused. I thought, if this turns into something worse, and no one has seen what actually happened, people might not believe her.
I did not post the video right away. I slept on it. But when I saw some of the first comments online calling her a troublemaker based only on the fact that security was called, I felt like people needed to see the beginning, not just the end. Have you been in contact with the media? Robert asked. A few reporters called, Tyler said. I have not done any big interviews. I wanted to see what the airline would say first. Understood, Linda replied. Thank you for your candor. We may reach out again as we work through our response. For now, you can drop off the line if you wish. Okay, he said. For what it is worth, I still like flying your airline. I just want it to be fair. The light on the speakerphone went dark. For a moment, the only sound was the faint rush of conditioned air. Linda clicked her pen once, a small, grounding sound. "You have heard from the crew and a passenger," she said. "Now we must decide how Blue Sky responds, publicly and internally." One board member, a woman with decades of experience in corporate communications, leaned forward. "We should issue a statement," she said. "Express regret for any distress caused, emphasize our commitment to equality, note that we are reviewing our procedures. We can handle the internal consequences quietly. There is no need to drag this out in public. It could harm the brand more than it helps anyone." Another director nodded. "We do not want this to become a larger symbol," he added. "If we make too much of it, we invite more scrutiny. Our customers want reassurance, not drama." Linda listened without interrupting, her face unreadable. Robert glanced again at Evelyn, waiting for her to speak. She remained silent for a long moment, looking at the still frame on the wall, her own image captured from the outside, seated, calm, refusing to move. When she finally spoke, her voice was softer than the room expected, but there was steel under the softness. "To be clear," she said, "we already are a symbol. The question is what we will represent. A company that quietly patches over its mistakes, or one that is willing to admit when its people have let bias guide their choices more than policy." The communications director started to answer, but Evelyn raised a hand slightly. "I know the playbook," she continued. "I have approved many versions of the statement you just described. Generic regret, reassurance, a promise to look into it. It is safe. It satisfies some people for a while. But it does not change the moment when a woman with a valid ticket is told, with a smile, that her presence is confusing to the system." Her gaze moved from seat to seat. "I built this airline," she said, "not by myself, but with all of you. I have asked our passengers, our employees, and our communities to trust the name on our planes. If we will not tell the truth about what happened when that name failed a black woman in first class, then the name is just paint." Silence followed her words, but it was not the defensive quiet from earlier. It was the kind of silence that comes when a room full of people realizes that the easy path has been closed to them by their own conscience. "So what are you proposing?" Robert asked gently, though he already suspected the answer. "We start with honesty," Evelyn replied. "We acknowledge publicly that a senior crew member and a valued customer allowed their assumptions to override our policies. We state that the incident was unacceptable, not because it went viral, but because it violated the dignity of a passenger and betrayed the values we claim to hold." She turned to Mark, and though her expression was not unkind, it was uncompromising. "Mr. Phillips should be removed from his current role in first class and placed on administrative leave while we review his record," she said. "If he returns to service, it should only be after he has completed serious training on implicit bias and passenger rights, and after he has demonstrated that he understands why what he did was wrong." Mark's throat bobbed. He had expected discipline. He had not expected it to be described so clearly in front of the board, by the very person he had tried to push aside. "As for Mrs. Reynolds," Evelyn continued, "we cannot control her choices, but we can reevaluate how we grant and manage special treatment. Loyalty programs cannot be allowed to create a class of passengers who believe they are entitled to override basic fairness." She shifted her focus back to the broader group. "Most importantly," she said, "we create a program, mandatory for all employees from the front desk to this table, that addresses dignity, not as a slogan, but as a core operating principle. We can call it what we like. I care less about the name than about the content. It must deal honestly with the ways race, class, and appearance still shape our split-second decisions." Linda nodded slowly, the outline of a plan forming in her mind. "A systemic training and accountability program," she said. "Regular audits of how complaints are handled. Clear channels for employees like Miss Cruz to raise concerns without fear. A public report on our progress after a set period." "Yes," Evelyn said, "that is a start." The director, who had spoken of statements and spin, looked down at her hands for a long moment. When she raised her head again, some of her defensiveness had slipped away. "If we do this," she said, "the public will know much more about our internal flaws than they do now. They will also know that we are willing to look at ourselves, Robert replied. That matters. He turned to Evelyn. You are sure you want to do this on the eve of being honored by a community that has every reason to doubt corporate promises? He asked. She allowed herself a small smile that did not quite reach her eyes. I would rather stand in front of them with the truth than with a polished lie, she said. They will recognize the difference. They always do. One by one, the board members nodded. Some did so reluctantly, others with a sense of relief, as if they had been waiting for someone to give them permission to choose the harder, cleaner path. Linda clicked her pen closed. Very well, she said. We will draft a statement that reflects exactly what has been said here. We will begin outlining the training program today. I will coordinate with human resources and operations. We will also reach out to Mr. Nguyen to thank him for bringing this to light, and to Miss Cruz to ensure she is protected from retaliation. She looked at Mark. Effective immediately, you are suspended from duty pending the outcome of this review, she said. You will receive details in writing by the end of the day. He nodded, a small defeated motion, the reality of consequences finally settling over him. The meeting moved on to logistics then, to timelines and committees, and the careful language of drafts. Evelyn contributed when needed, but her thoughts were already half a step ahead, imagining the faces that would listen to her the next evening in Harlem, the questions in their eyes. When the last agenda item had been addressed, chairs scraped softly against the floor as people rose. Murmured goodbyes and brief nods passed around the table. Isabel slipped out quietly, her shoulders a little lighter than when she came in. Mark left with slower steps, carrying a folder instead of a flight manifest. Soon the room was empty, save for Evelyn and the sound of her own breathing. She stood and walked to the window, resting one hand lightly on the cool glass. Below, on the tarmac, a blue sky plane rolled toward the runway, engines turning. Another waited at the gate, jet bridge extended, ready to swallow up a new line of travelers carrying their own stories and expectations. She watched as the moving aircraft reached the head of the runway and paused. Then, with a roar muted by distance and thick glass, it began to accelerate, nose lifting, leaving the ground behind. The sight had thrilled her since she was a girl, but today it carried a different weight. Each departure was a promise written in the company's colors, that anyone who boarded would be carried with equal care no matter where they sat. Her phone vibrated in her pocket, a small insistent buzz against her hip. She took it out and looked at the screen. A message from the organizer in Harlem glowed there, full of warmth and expectation. They were finalizing the program, the note said. The community was excited. They hoped she would share something personal about her journey when she spoke. She stood there a moment longer, the light from the runway reflecting on the glass and on the phone in her hand, thinking about the questions waiting for her in that Harlem hall, and about what kind of truth they deserved to hear from a woman who had just seen, from the inside, how far her own company still had to go. By late afternoon, the light in Harlem had turned soft and gold, slipping down between brick buildings and across the windows of the small community center on the corner. Inside, rows of wooden chairs faced a low stage draped with a simple banner celebrating local business leaders. Folding tables along the back wall held paper cups, coffee and silver urns, pitchers of lemonade, and plates of cookies that would be half gone before the night was over. People filtered in slowly, shaking off the chill from outside, pausing to greet old friends with hugs and easy laughter. Some moved with canes, their steps careful, faces lined by years. Others were younger, carrying notebooks and phones, eyes bright as they scanned the crowd for familiar names. On the walls hung black and white photographs of marches and meetings from another era. Faces turned toward distant microphones, hands held high. Near the front, a woman in a navy dress adjusted the microphone stand, then glanced toward the side of the stage. When she saw Evelyn waiting there, she smiled. "We are almost ready," she whispered. "They have been talking about hearing from you all week." Evelyn nodded, fingers resting lightly on the edge of the podium. The low murmur of the room washed over her, a different kind of hum than the one in the airplane cabin. This sound carried history, expectation, and a familiar kind of skepticism. No one in this room believed automatically in a corporate promise. They believed in stories and in what people did after the applause ended. The program moved through its first speakers. A young entrepreneur describing a new food truck business, a teacher talking about a scholarship fund, an elder recalling the opening of a small bank branch decades earlier that had finally lent money to residents no one else would consider. Each story added another layer to the sense that this room was a crossroads between past and future. Then the host stepped to the microphone. "Our next honoree is a woman whose name you have seen on airplanes and in articles," she said, her voice warm. "Many of you know her story. Some of you remember when she was one of the only faces like ours in certain rooms. Today, she is the chairwoman of an airline that carries millions of people every year. Please welcome Miss Evelyn Carter." Applause rose, steady and genuine. Evelyn walked onto the stage, the wooden floor creaking softly under her steps. As she reached the podium, she took a moment to look out over the crowd. She saw church hats, braided hair, gray beards, children perched on parents' knees. She saw people who had known what it meant to be turned away, and people who had heard those stories at kitchen tables. "Good evening," she said, and her voice slipped easily into the room, low and clear. "Thank you for inviting me here. It is good to be back in Harlem." She spoke first of her childhood, of long bus rides and tiny kitchens where her parents counted bills under yellow lamplight. She told them about the first time she watched a plane lift off and wondered what it would take to be part of that world. She kept her words simple, letting the images do the work. The worn suitcase, the thin coat, the first job counting tickets instead of sitting in the seats herself. Gradually, she led them forward through the years. The study, the late nights, the early flights, the moments of open doubt when people had asked her, in more or less polite terms, whether someone like her really belonged in aviation. She did not rush. Her pauses allowed the audience to fill in their own memories. Then she shifted, gently. "You have seen pictures of me with officials and in boardrooms," she said. "You have read headlines that call me a chairwoman. But a few days ago, I sat in a very different place. I sat in seat 2A on one of my own airline's planes, as an ordinary passenger with an ordinary ticket." A low murmur moved through the crowd. Some had already seen the video on their phones. Others had heard fragments on the news. All of them leaned in. "I watched a situation unfold in that cabin," she continued, "where my presence in that seat was treated as a mistake, something the system had done wrong. I listened as someone assumed that another customer's comfort, based on their familiarity and appearance, outweighed my right to keep what I had paid for and been assigned." She did not name Catherine or Mark. She did not have to. The pattern she described was familiar in many forms. "Let me be clear," she said, voice firming. "On that day, what hurt me most was not that people did not recognize my title. I did not tell them who I was. What hurt was how quickly some of them decided that a black woman, sitting quietly in first class, must be in the wrong place, even when the paper in her hand said otherwise." Heads nodded around the room. A few elders exchanged looks that said, "Without planes, we have seen this on trains and at counters." "There was, as you know, a twist," she went on. "When security arrived and asked for identification, the card in my wallet forced those assumptions into the light. In that moment, authority shifted. Suddenly, the person they had treated as an inconvenience became someone they feared disappointing." She let the irony hang there for a moment, then softened. "I do not tell you this for the drama of it," she said. "I tell you because it showed me two things at once. First, how thin the distance still is between respect and disregard when you look like we do. Second, how much power there is in telling the truth while the cameras are still on and the reports are still being written." She spoke then about the meeting at headquarters, about the decision to suspend a trusted employee and to rethink loyalty programs that fed a sense of entitlement. She described, in broad strokes, the training and accountability work they had committed to start, not as a quick decorative patch, but as something that would require time, discomfort, and honesty. "Some people have asked me if I was embarrassed that this happened on my watch," she said.
They wonder if I wish the video had never gone out into the world. I will be honest with you.
For a few hours I did. No one likes seeing their company's failures displayed like that. She smiled softly. But then I remembered something my father used to say, she continued. He would tell me, if a light comes on in a room you thought was clean and you see dust in the corners, do not blame the light. Thank it, and then pick up a broom. The room rippled with low laughter and murmured agreement. That video, that young man recording from row 4, the courage of a junior flight attendant willing to tell the truth afterward, those were lights, she said. They showed us dust in corners we had convinced ourselves were spotless. I cannot be angry at that. I can only be grateful we saw it before the dust turned into something worse. She paused, then leaned slightly closer to the microphone. What makes me hopeful is not that I am the chairwoman of an airline, she said, voice deepening with feeling. What makes me hopeful is that people without titles at all are starting to say, no, this is not right, and to back those words up with action. She did not raise her hand, but her words lifted something in the room. People began to clap, slowly at first, then with more force. Some stood. A few wiped tears from their eyes, remembering times when no one with power had said such things on a public stage. When the noise settled, she finished gently, speaking of the next generation, of the girl in Queens waiting with a homemade pie, of the hope that one day a child with her granddaughter's face would sit in any seat on any plane without wondering who might question her right to be there. She ended not with a triumphant promise that bigotry was finished, but with a quieter commitment. I cannot promise that you or your children will never be misjudged again, she said, but I can promise that as long as my name is on those planes, we will not pretend not to see it when it happens. We will not call it a misunderstanding and move on. We will pick up the broom. The applause that followed felt different from the earlier clapping. It was not just for her achievements or her title. It was for the way she had chosen to stand in the uncomfortable middle between community and corporation, bringing the truth of each into the other's air. Later that evening, in a modest house in Queens, the smell of baked chicken and roasted vegetables filled a small kitchen. The table was set with mismatched plates and a vase of supermarket flowers. A television in the corner played the local news with the sound low, closed captions scrolling across the bottom of the screen. Evelyn sat at the table with her daughter and son-in-law, their hands still busy passing bowls and refilling glasses. Her granddaughter sat between them, swinging her legs, a smear of chocolate on her cheek from a dessert sample she had been allowed before dinner. "They showed your speech already," her daughter said, nodding toward the television. "Just a brief clip, but it was good. They cut out the part where you talked about dust and brooms, though. I liked that part." "They have their own time limits," Evelyn replied, smiling. "That is all right. The people in the room heard it." Her son-in-law shook his head slowly. "I still cannot believe they did that to you on your own plane," he said. "I mean, I can believe it because I know how people are, but it still makes me angry." "It is not about me," she answered. "It is about what that moment reveals for everyone else. If it can happen to me with all my protection, imagine how it can happen to someone with none." Her granddaughter, who had been listening more closely than they realized, looked up. "Grandma," she asked, "when I grow up, will people talk to me like that lady on the plane talked to you?" The question landed like a small stone in a still pool. The adults at the table exchanged quick glances. Evelyn took a breath, choosing her words carefully. "I hope fewer people will talk that way," she said, "but I cannot promise you that no one ever will. What I can promise is that there will be more people around you who say, that is not okay, and do something about it." The child frowned thoughtfully. "Like the man with the phone," she said, "and the lady who told the truth about what she heard." "Yes," Evelyn replied, "exactly like them." Her granddaughter nodded, apparently satisfied for now, and reached for another piece of bread. The conversation shifted to school projects and neighbor gossip, to the small, comforting details of everyday life. Yet the earlier question stayed with Evelyn like a quiet echo at the back of her mind. Later, when the dishes were stacked in the sink and the house had fallen into a soft evening rhythm, she stepped outside for a moment.
The air in Queens was cool, carrying the distant rumble of traffic and the occasional siren.
Above the row houses and streetlights, she could see the faint blink of aircraft lights crossing the sky, tiny moving stars tracing paths she knew by heart. Days passed. Blue Sky released its statement. It did not hide behind vague phrases. It named what had happened and outlined the steps the company was taking. The reaction was mixed, as she had expected. Some praised the honesty, some accused the airline of overreacting. A few insisted that bringing race into the discussion was unnecessary. Those voices were loud, but they were not alone anymore. Inside the company, training sessions began under the banner of a new initiative focused on dignity. The first of those sessions included a short, edited version of the Flight 417 video, along with guided discussion about implicit bias and power. In one of the early groups, Isabel stood at the front of a small conference room, hands trembling slightly, describing what it had felt like to be torn between her sense of right and her fear of speaking against her supervisor. People listened. Some shifted uncomfortably in their chairs. Others came up afterward to thank her. Mark attended as well, at first with arms folded, jaw set. Over time, the defensive lines in his face softened. He spoke in one session about how he had learned to equate smooth operations with keeping certain customers happy above all. How invisible that equation had been to him until he watched himself on that screen. He did not ask for sympathy. He asked for the chance to do better. News trickled back to Evelyn about the consequences for Catherine. Some clients had called to express concern. A few had quietly moved their business elsewhere. She had not lost everything, but she no longer moved through airports with quite the same unexamined ease. Whether that would lead to real change in her heart, no one could say. But the mirror had been held up. That mattered. Some weeks later, as winter gave way to a shy early spring, Evelyn found herself once again walking down a jet bridge toward a Blue Sky aircraft. This time there were no cameras, no waiting officer, no audience beyond the usual line of passengers juggling bags and boarding passes. She had booked a seat in first class again, not as a test, but because it made long days a little easier on her body. Still, part of her was aware of every detail as she stepped through the door. The tone of the greeting, the way the attendant's eyes moved between boarding pass and face, the subtle shifts in posture around her. "Welcome aboard, Miss Carter," the young woman at the door said, reading the name from the paper without any sign of recognition beyond professional courtesy. "You are in 2C on the right side. Let us know if you need anything." Evelyn thanked her and moved into the cabin. As she stowed her bag and sat down, she noticed a small moment a few rows ahead. A black man in a worn jacket, carrying more than one piece of hand luggage, stood in the aisle blinking at his ticket, clearly unsure if he was in the right place. His clothes spoke of careful budgeting rather than luxury. The seat he was aiming for was in the same cabin as hers. Before any awkwardness could grow, a flight attendant stepped up with an easy smile. "Sir, may I help you find your seat?" she asked. There was no strain in her voice, no hint of doubt. He handed her the boarding pass, apologizing under his breath as if he expected to be scolded. "No need to be sorry," she said. "You are exactly where you are supposed to be. This way." She led him to his seat and helped stow his bag, chatting about the weather at their destination, the snacks that would be offered, whether he preferred an aisle or window for the next time he flew. At no point did she suggest that the system might have made a mistake in putting him there. She did not talk about upgrades or loyal customers. She treated him simply and completely as a person who belonged where his ticket said he did. Evelyn watched this from her seat, feeling something unclench inside her chest. It was a small moment, one interaction on one plane out of many. It would not solve every problem. There would still be other days, other flights, other people who failed to see their own blind spots. But here, now, the dust in one corner had been swept. The safety demonstration began. Overhead bins clicked shut. The aircraft pushed back from the gate. As the engines wound up and the runway rushed beneath them, Evelyn let her head rest gently against the seat back. Outside the thick window, the wing tilted, lifting towards sunlight air. Clouds rose to meet them, white and soft, parting around the moving metal like a slow tide.
She turned her face toward the glass and watched the wings slice cleanly through a bank of cloud, leaving a brief, fading trail. Somewhere far below, neighborhoods and roads and community centers spread in patterns she could no longer see. In all those places, people would go on facing moments where justice was tested, where truth was asked to step forward or step aside.
There would be many more flights after this one, many more rooms where hard conversations waited, many more chances for people with and without titles to decide who belonged where. Not every decision would be right. Not every dust mote would be caught by the light. But now, at least, there was one airline that had looked at its own reflection and chosen not to look away, and one community that had seen that choice and decided it would not let them forget. Evelyn closed her eyes for a moment, feeling the steady vibration of the engines under her feet, the thin air pressing gently against the skin of the plane. When she opened them again, the sky ahead was a wide, pale blue, and the wing beside her continued forward through the clouds, carrying her and everyone on board into whatever waited beyond.